My name is Andy Haigh, and I am Director of Climate Positive Solutions for Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland. So Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland are a property company based in the UK, and my role is essentially to kind of lead and deliver our net zero carbon pathway.
Great, thanks. So I want to start off by asking you, what are the steps that any kind of organisation should take to create a net zero strategy or plan?
Really good question. It's quite a meaty one to get us started off with. For me, the most important thing is to understand your baseline, understand, your starting point. And that takes time, and for me, it also takes capturing a lot of data. So you really need to understand what both your direct and your indirect impacts are. So you need to, it's not just a question of just going and looking at your electricity and gas bills for your offices, but it's also thinking about what is kind of a crucial indirect impact to you. Do you do a lot of business travel? Do you procure a significant amount of, I don't know, it could be stationery, or it could be, for us, are you, as a property company, we have a huge amount of development impacts, or, the impacts associated with our tenants. So you need to think about what is significant to your business outside of just what you directly procure. You then need to think about taking from your baseline, where do you need to get to? So a net zero pathway obviously revolves around absolute emissions reductions from that baseline year to a point in time in the future. Most people are using 2030 as a kind of a goal for when they want to make significant reductions. The Science Based Target Initiative states that you should be making a 4.2% annual reduction excuse me, from your baseline to 2030. So that's quite a nice, easy decarbonisation strategy. And I would always say that you should be following the science. You shouldn't be just creating arbitrary reductions. You should be looking at what the best science is telling you. Then from there, so it hasn't been launched yet, but the Science Based Target Initiative will be launching just before COP an updated version of their approved science-based target, which is now stating that organisations should also not just be aiming for a 4.2% annual reduction by 2030, they should be looking for an absolute emissions reductions of 90% by 2050 or beyond, or before. So you need to start thinking about, where is your midpoint and endpoint as part of your journey, and how do you want to make those reductions? And I've mentioned the Science-Based Target Initiative. It's led in part by the WWF, but it uses kind of the latest science. You don't have to use them, but I do think definitions are really important. So how you're defining what you're basing your absolute emissions reductions on, and how you're defining what net zero means. It has to be credible and robust, and aligning to something like the SBTI, Science-Based Target Initiative, is a very useful way of doing that. So if you've then got this baseline, and your baseline year of, let's say it's 2021 or 2019 before COVID, and you've got your reduction pathway, you then need to think about what realistic steps you can and need to make in order to reduce that impact. An arbitrary 4.2% reduction is meaningless unless you know how you're going to deliver against that. And then you can start to think about what existing measures there are in place to help you on that pathway. So, if the majority of your emissions are electricity, grid decarbonisation means that actually you're a long way to achieving that. I don't want to say without doing anything, but there's a lot that's already in place to help you along that path. Similar to electric fleets, if a large proportion of your impact is within either your own fleets or the fleets of your supply chain, actually we know there's going to be huge changes over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, and more people moving over to electric fleets. So you don't know that you can start to build that into your pathway, and how you are, you proactively tackle those types of things. So, for Grosvenor, moving from gas to electric heating is the easiest, or not the easiest, but it's a very big, significant jump into our decarbonisation strategy. So you've created your baseline. You've then thought about your decarbonisation or your absolute emissions reductions targets and where you want to get to, whether it's 2030 or beyond. You started to think about how you're going to deliver that. And you then really need to go and start engaging with well, it depends on your business, either the key stakeholders first or your leadership first in terms of how you get that, how you build that in. So internal stakeholders are incredibly important, either your facilities team for capturing information or, your HR team, IT, etc. Also external stakeholders. So depending on how big your indirect impacts are, your key suppliers, your travel agency, etc. Actually going and engaging with them and seeing what they're doing. Companies are doing so much around this already, and you'll also find that most people in your organization are probably already inspired to do things but don't feel empowered to do it. So going and engaging with people, just talking about it, but you need to be the ones going there with the plan and, or the semblance of a plan, and help steer and lead those conversations. And I think once you do, and once you start, other people start coming to the table with their own ideas and help build this kind of rich, much richer strategy around it. But I think engagement is key. It can't be an individual leading strategies. It has to be led by the leadership, but also with all those stakeholders in the business.
How have you found kind of how has that net zero pathway been rolled out across the whole of your business? Does it come from leadership and then it's kind of launched to all employees? Do people feel like they understand it? Does it need to be understood by everyone?
Well, yeah, I mean, in my introduction, I said I'm responsible for delivering it, but I'm definitely not solely responsible for delivering our net zero pathway. It is very much led by our chief exec and our executive committee, which means that it's a lot easier to get things approved if they're proactive and actually want us to change. A net zero strategy will require transformative change in at least some parts of the business.
Yeah.
It could just be in your HR and how you recruit and retain and support and train staff, or it could be in your IT systems or your fleet or your facilities, but there'll be some part of your business, if not multiple different parts, which will be required to be transformed over the course of the next 10 years away from business as usual. So it has to be led from the top, and the more internal stakeholders you have who feel empowered to change, the better. At Grosvenor, it's linked to our remuneration. So it's linked to our bonuses, it's linked to the performance monitoring of our business. So which really empowers people to change. But obviously it takes a while to get to that point where the company's that committed to actually put it as part of your review and remuneration package. But it can never be the responsibility of one person to do it in isolation. And I genuinely, going back to that, engaging with others, you will find so many people who actually want to be part of this, but don't feel empowered to help support. And once you unlock those individuals, you should really see your strategy kind of just grow legs.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So I think you've kind of touched on this, but how did developing a net zero kind of pathway work for Grosvenor?
So Grosvenor's baseline was 60,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year, which we think is huge. I think for most companies probably is significant. For others it might be considered tiny, but that's our baseline.
Yeah.
94% of that is within our value chain, so it's our indirect impacts.
So and just to ask a question on that, so that's your tenants, suppliers?
Yeah, so 27% of our emissions are from our tenants. 8% of our emissions are from the embodied carbon in our developments. 59% is within our supply chain. So that's through the procurement from services such as IT and HR and legal services, to the procurement of repairs and maintenance contracts and things like that. And then so the 6% that we're directly responsible for, 1% of that is in our corporate activities. So essentially business travel and the management of our own buildings. And 5% of it is in the landlord electricity and gas usage in our our managed tenanted buildings. So we're responsible for 6%. And I think historically people used to just talk about the 6%, their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they used to ignore the rest. But actually, you really need to take full account of your value chain as well, because we can't ignore the materials that go into our buildings. We can't ignore the impact that our money has in our supply chain. And so we've had to put in a number of, and I should also mention, so our net zero pathway means we're having a 52% reduction from our 2019 baseline year to 2030. So across all of our tenants and our suppliers, everyone, we're enforcing over a 50% reduction in that. We're not waiting till 2030. We're obviously starting now. We saw a 20% reduction in 2020, but we're also from 2021, we're starting to offset all of our corporate emissions and our development, embodied carbon emissions. And by 2025, we're actually going to be offsetting all of the emissions associated with our impacts, that whole kind of 100% of the pot, to help others join us on the journey to net zero, because we think it's more empowering if people see that us actively wanting to lead, we'll then be able to find kind of better suppliers and tenants who want to join us on that journey. But it's obviously quite difficult trying to go out and engage with all of these different stakeholder groups and inspire them to come on the journey with us. So you have to have like a number of different tools in place. So as an example, for our tenants, we have green leases, we have an energy savings fund or a retrofit fund. So we're helping to both, write into contracts the requirement for kind of energy efficiency and reporting, but also kind of go to the table with, a pot of money and saying, we'll work with you to improve the energy efficiency of your buildings, because it helps you out, but also helps us out as well.
That's really interesting. So is that how you define a green lease?
So for us, a green lease is a requirement for a tenant to, first of all, report their energy performance.
Okay.
And going back to the data and how you set up your baseline and your strategy, understanding your impact is critical, and it's a constant battle.
Yeah.
We had to put a large number of assumptions into our baseline year one, because we don't know what our tenants are doing. We give them the keys and take money off at the end of the month, but they get to do whatever they want in that space. So there are kind of industry assumptions for the energy efficiency of a corporate office versus a retail unit versus a restaurant, etc. So we're now going from those, industry assumptions to actually getting real data from our tenants.
That's great.
Which means that year on year we get a much better, more kind of rounded or more accurate view of what our emissions actually are. And I should probably, going back to your first question, you want to focus on accuracy as much as possible, but you also need to be realistic to the fact that there will be assumptions in your modeling, because if this is the first time you've done it, there will be questions left unanswered. And as long as you're comfortable with that, you can make other people comfortable with that. We knew less than 10% of our tenant electricity consumption when we wrote our baseline. We now know over a quarter of it, but that means there's 75% of our tenanted areas where we're still trying to find that data. But we're comfortable in that space because we're using an industry average unless we know better.
So you basically advise people to just get on and do something instead of, okay.
Don't wait till you got the perfect answer, because then you've missed the opportunity to affect change. Just get on with it.
And you can use things, as you say, like industry standards.
Yeah, and there are enough out there. There are enough kind of toolkits and calculators, and plenty of them are free. So once you start looking into it, you'll find a resource or another which will help you on this journey. And as long as you're transparent about it and what you've assumed versus what is accurate, people won't hold it against you. But if you go and pretend you know absolutely everything, that's when people will start to be critical.
Of course. So kind of building on that point then, what skills do you need within an organisation to get going on your net zero pathway or even achieve net zero?
I think you need to be driven and passionate about the subject for sure. I'm assuming most people listening to this probably are. it can take a really long time, or it can be really quick. You could think a conversation might be a really difficult one, but actually the person you're talking to is really empowered. Or it could be the complete opposite, and you go in there and you think you're going to have to really fight. You think you have a really easy conversation, you actually have to fight for it.
Yeah.
So I guess negotiation is critical. Also having kind of patience, because you're unlocking transformative change across an organization, which means that's lots of different stakeholders, and it can take longer than you'd potentially hope. But you have to keep on going at it in order to affect change. I think it's really important to be able to see what the business case is, or be able to sell the business case, I should say. So, there's either the risk associated with inaction, or there's the kind of the profitability or productivity, or whatever the benefits are of positive action. So, the risks of inaction are, will you lose market share? Will you become unprofitable? Are you at greater risk of, the actual physical risks of climate change, such as flooding, storm damage, overheating, etc., of your existing assets? Some of the positives are, we know that ESG funds outperform conventional funds. So we know that sustainable companies typically outperforming traditional companies in that regard. So you can kind of find models or find examples of why it's better to be positively and outwardly facing sustainable in order to attract new markets. And there are many companies such as ourselves. I mean, we've got a fairly large supply chain, and we're actively now saying that if it's a contract over £1 million, you'll need to have a science-based target. If you're a contract over £500,000, you'll need to report all of your kind of energy and energy performance, as well as a number of other metrics around kind of social sustainability as well. And so we're actively going and writing into contracts now requirements for our suppliers to deliver kind of the similar standards that we have. So that's both a risk and a benefit, depending on what side of the table you are. If you're not acting, then it's a risk, because you won't be able to work with a company such as myself. But equally, if you're trying to justify it, you'll be able to sell it as you'll be able to work with all these new market players who we haven't worked with in the past, but we've now got something that people they currently work with don't have. And it's a much stronger bargaining chip with, a significant number of companies that are looking to do that. And it's only going to go one way.
Definitely. Do you think do you need to kind of have experts, internal experts, or work with experts to help you identify those risks, or to even help you on your net zero pathway?
It depends. It depends how big your business is, depends how complex it is. If you're a relatively small business, you can probably get away with finding a supportive leader who understands, what's your company risk register, what are your key recruitment processes. There are a number of business drivers that you wouldn't necessarily, as just a sustainability coordinator, whatever your role is in the business, necessarily understand. So you could be able to figure that out if you've got a kind of a mentor or a champion within your organization, and that's probably the best place to start. It could be someone in finance, and they're really good at unlocking the business case. It could be someone in HR, which would be very good at unlocking kind of the social impact case. And HR, as I said, it's written in our remuneration packages. They're key to deliver the training and the kind of grassroots requirements for it. And also, increasingly, as part of the recruitment process, people are looking for purpose-driven companies. So HR departments are seeing the real value in creating or kind of really flagging purpose in an organization. So talking to HR or finance are probably two really good places to start. And it's probably that those are the types of conversations that a sustainability consultant might find harder to begin, because you think they're so outside of your scope. or your remit, but starting there. If your company's really complex, you may have to go out to a consultant. It can be quite time consuming, but I definitely don't say you have to.
Okay, thank you. I might just skip to our last question. And you've kind of alluded to this, but why do you think organisations need to kind of get going on their net zero strategy right now?
Well, why wait? Why wouldn't you? Like, why would you wait for 5 years to see what happens?
Yeah.
You know, like the UN's called this the decade of action. The IPCC report from, I want to say September of this year, could have been, yeah, September this year, I think it was, basically proves that we're causing irreparable damage to the climate, and every minute of delay is just further worsening the problem. So, like, why wouldn't you? I guess that's the simple call to arms. Like, we should be doing more of it. One of the reasons why Grosvenor brought forward our offsetting strategy was that even though we feel we've got a leading net zero pathway, we were going to wait to offset until 2030 in a meaningful way. But that still means that with our 52% absolute emissions reductions, we're responsible for 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere this year. Sorry, not this year, this decade. So, like, why would we wait? Let's start offsetting as well. Let's just do as much as we can as soon as we can. And we're doing that for the moral imperative, but also because we genuinely think that if we don't act, there's greater risk that our tenants won't want to work in our, or what's it called? Yeah, work and live in our properties, that we won't be able to attract the best minds to our business, that our supply chain won't want to work with us because they don't feel that we're empowered. So we're not just doing it for a philanthropic purpose. We're doing it because we think long term as a business, and that if we don't act now, we're not going to be productive and successful and what's it called, reactive to the environment that we're going to see ourselves in 5 and 10 years time. So yeah, why wait? Just get on with it.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's a very strong message to end on.
Well, thank you very much.
Stop.